So let's get Mr. Shanahan to start it off. Microbiome speaks to the brain. That's incredible. I watched a video the other night, a TED Talk. They were doing trials and tests with microbiome from humans to mice. And it's called a bubble mouse. A bubble mouse is a mouse that is lazy, that's been environmentally in one spot, doesn't do much at all, very lazy. And they took the microbiome of a depressed person and put it in the mouse, and the mouse got depressed. They took the microbiome of a healthy person, and another mouse would run around the maze figuring out things where they're traditionally not known to do so. So when we hear about the microbiome speaking to the brain, what would you say, Mr. Shannon, in terms of the situation travellers are in now? You're watching the microbiome slip away to an industrial world, which is a forced simulation. What can be done? What needs to be done, do you think?
Just on that comment about the microbiome talking to the brain first, it's actually very clever, but the brain actually receives information from every part of your body. It has to do that, because if you've got all these complex things going on, for example, billions of microbes in your gut, food moving from your mouth all the way down to the anal area, extracting calories, processing the stuff, digesting it, moving all this, and you don't have to be conscious, apart from the time when you pass gas or when you eat or excrete. You're not conscious of that. So the brain is coordinating all of that. So to be able to coordinate all that, it's a bit like the Dublin Port Tunnel. You have to have information back to Central Command to see what's happening, or else everything would grind to a halt. So the brain's receiving all this information, and it does it through nerves coming from the gut up to the brain. Most of the information is going from gut to brain. Only 20% of it is going back down. The brain can actually respond and regulate, and if it feels you need to have diarrhea to excrete something, it'll make you have diarrhea. So it's primarily a response of the brain. So there's no doubt about the communications. It's another leap to say that any of this is causing depression. Now, those studies you talk about, many of those are my friends, my colleagues, and the bubble is something that was a facility that I wrote the grant to get in Cork, and so I know all that stuff. But I've always felt that, yes, it is relevant what's going on in your gut to brain health, but I think there's a danger in overstating it. And I'm speaking against my own work now to some degree. I actually think the greater impact on traveller health is likely, I don't have proof, but it's likely, what you see in these posters, is likely to be the continual erosion of culture in your way of life. Now that's contributed by changes in the microbiome, as I've shown you, it's relevant. But I think that is such a profound thing that I wouldn't want to in any way do any harm or diminish that story by just talking about microbiome. What I think the microbiome tells you is you have an absolute marker of your identity, you have an absolute 21st century measurement that you have this way of life, you seem to be losing it, it seems to be affecting your microbiome, and that will have additional health consequences down the road. Some of them are related to, will influence your brain health, mental health, but you don't need a microbiome to have poor mental health. Any ethnic group that is deprived of its way of life and everything it stood for, if that's whipped away from you, it's like taking someone's identity away, and I can't see that that could be good for anyone's mental health.
Absolutely. Mary, Fergus Shannon talks about how Irish travellers retained an ancient microbiome that goes back a long way. Retained it, kept it, somehow or another. That's not the only thing travellers retained. When we think about the music, the Irish instruments, the poems, the songs, they also retained that. And often it has been said it was lost to the settled people. That's kind of interesting also, that a lot of the Gaelic traditions that travellers still had, including a microbiome, were lost to the settled people. In terms of the music, the stories, the songs, and yet sadly, throughout all of that, and Fergus mentioned the importance for settled people to understand traveller microbiome as a health benefit to themselves. And yet, between the research and all that we have given, or all that has been taken, we're at a situation where children are killing themselves. something not quite right there, is there?
No, we've had a lot wrong for a long time. We've a lot actually right as well. We're hearing a lot today about, what has been taken away from us, and one of the things that we have over the centuries have retained within the traveller community, have brought along with us and have been the core part of who we are, is storytelling, music, making things, being people that were able to live from the land, that simplistic lifestyle, but yet so creative, and the talents that are within our community are astronomical. It's just that, they a lot, again, as travellers, we get bypassed a lot for things. And as Fergus was saying, not even being able for himself to be able to get funding for him to be able to continue research in this matter, for us as travellers to be backed in what it is that we need as, like, our creativity. Yes, we can talk about microbiome and our gut. We can be really, really healthy people, and still I want to take my own life tomorrow morning, So our mental health, physical health, but our mental health has been eroded. And I believe that part of where we can go forward with is allowing people to explore who they are again as a people, and not to be conform to the norm, or to try to be like other societies, or to be influenced by, and you will, obviously everything has an influence in life, but to be influenced by what other people think of you. So you then change who you are to suit them, you're living your life, you're being dictated by other people. And and I find, and that could be your own sister, it could be your brother, it could be your mother, it could be strangers, it could be the wider settled community. But as a traveller, one thing that we have in the core heart and soul of us is creativity. And we need, as a people, to remind ourselves that we can still be sick and laugh, we can still be sick and sing a song. We can still be sick and watch a film and be part of something. Our mental health has been eroded. I've had numerous deaths in my family through suicide. There's even Max Casey, for example. I think she had, I think there was 27 in Max? 32 in Max Casey's family that had taken their lives to suicide. And it's happening every single day, and it's even happening under the radar, where we're not actually being, so what happens is, each of the health centres, they send out primary healthcare workers to sites and stuff like that, and they get the numbers of how many possibly has bad kidneys, it could be liver, it could be whatever, cancer, and they take these markers, send them back to the HSC, and then they get their stats and this information. But there's a lot of people that have been going unheard of, and there's a lot of travellers that haven't admitted who they are, or hasn't actually retained or put on a piece of paper to say that, yes, I am part of the traveller community. So we're losing a lot of the stats, and I'm sick and tired of research. Even though it's needed, I'm sick and tired of it, because it's always a meeting about a meeting for a meeting with a meeting, and then 6 months down the line, what happened to the research you did last year? And never mind that, we're going to do this research now. Well, we as a people, we need to mind that, because it's us that research is being done on. So as a community, we need to start implementing the arts back into our lives, and that's possibly through song, music, dance, language, being part of the programme, encouraging your children to possibly take up something that maybe you and your family would have had. Like me and my family, for example, I have no musicians in my immediate family, my brothers and sisters, but I do have aunts and uncles that would have played instruments, and then I have nieces and nephews that play instruments, so kind of skipped a few of us. But I want to, as a person that's in the arts every day, I have a community development background, so I bring community development into the arts, but I also remind the people that we do not, yes, we need money to make these things happen, but it's not always about the shiny things, and it's not always about, the gold star and the stickers and, the my name is going to be put on something. It's about going out there into the heart of the community and actually sitting down and actually being part of something that you as a people have carried through this land for generations. You brought music. Even the music itself has travelled worldwide across the whole, the whole world has heard Irish music. But yet, I'm not going to say settled people did not bring it along with them, because there has been many, but it was the core of the Irish travellers that kept it and stopped it from being eroded by the English, and stopped it from being taken from us. And then we gave it back to the settled people, and then they took it from us and went, thanks. and went and made money from us and took our names and took our music, took our whatever, do you know, and made it their own, and then it became theirs again, do you know. And it's you were thinking, like somebody says, oh, it's ours again, and I was like, was it ever truly yours? Because you became colonized, you changed who you were to suit a narrative that was not ours. Do you know, you took something from us and now we gave it back to you and you don't appreciate it.
Just as
Sorry, Susie.
Is it okay to comment, or are you?
yeah, I was going to ask
No,
them
go
one
ahead,
question
go ahead.
each, and then we're
Yeah,
going
go
to.
ahead, go
Sorry,
ahead.
just one last thing is, if it's any advice I can give you here, even though, like, obviously there's some people here that suffer mental health, as family members with mental health issues, or have seen the destitute mental health within the community. One thing I'm asking you to do is go back and sit with your children, go back and sit with your nieces and nephews, your grandchildren, and encourage them, literally encourage them to take up something that our people has carried through with them for generations, and that could be poetry, it could be writing, it could be music. Allow our mental health to be just as good as our physical health.
Absolutely, and I think there is ways of doing that, because I've heard many experts talk about psychological trauma and how, because it's in the brain and because we think about it, there is ways also to slow it down, understand it, and even stop it eventually. And I think that would stop a lot of the intergenerational trauma also. Fergus Shanahan talks about retaining the microbiome, as I mentioned, hinted about the music, Mary filled it in. And also, we're sick of being researched. It's a two-part question for Dylan. What community in this situation where there's travellers and then there's who? Settled people. Have settled people ever been researched? Have you ever found research as an archaeologist? Also, just before you answer that, we mentioned about retaining the music, the arts, and the microbiome. And I also mentioned apparently it was lost to the settled people. Do you have any idea why or how it could have been lost to the settled people?
Well, I would say one thing, which is it's interesting. Like, if you were to take up, say go to England or something, you would find it unusual if you were to say that the population was split into settled and not settled English, for example, or even the word that we use, the word settled, is kind of interesting, and it points towards that colonial thing you're talking about, where you used to have, in America, you'd have settled Native Americans and wild Native Americans, or those that are not settled but it's a perspective that only comes from the person who's building a new system in that country. From their point of view, there's good Indians and bad Indians, right? To put it kind of in the old cowboy terms. So yeah, the fact that there's a settled population at all is interesting. But what, and this is where sociologists and others will know this, but in history it's well known. The dominant culture in any situation is one of the ways it's dominating is it's invisible. It throws a cloak of invisibility over itself. So it's, in that sense, it's not there to be studied in the same way that what you're describing, travellers are, oh yeah, we'll do a study, we'll do another study, maybe ones that don't lead anywhere. We can say why they don't lead anywhere. There could be great information in them, but when none of them address the system, as in where the system came from, just in a simple way, it's not a personal thing about anyone who's in the system or out of it. It's just that the system was built for a certain reason under certain circumstances. And we actually know what those circumstances were, and they were not conducive to a good outcome for a lot of the population in Ireland, because they were by force, essentially. And the idea was to change the Irish population. In fact, they wrote about it many times in the 16th and 17th and 18th century. The whole point was to change the population. And as Bernard would point out, they never really, those laws weren't changed in 1922, but it's merely addressing the fact that, it's merely recognizing that as one thing, but then, okay, it's saying, okay, well, the spotlight is turned onto travellers because they're declared to be the anomaly, because everybody else is supposed to be normal. But it's an irony of history that the further we go back in history in Ireland, for example, this, what we now call the settled population, would become smaller and smaller until the point where they would only be in certain towns, say even not that far back. So let's say 1600 or 1500, 400 or 500 years ago, is only about 15 generations. I think that's not even much in microbiome terms, 15 generations, maybe 20 at most, and you're back to a situation where most of the country would have been regarded as somewhat nomadic. Most of it was Gaelic Ireland. There was no towns for hundreds of miles, you know. The population was spread out across the country, and the minority would have been what we now call settled people, in a sense, or because they were the colony in small towns that had little walls around them. And so it's just interesting that picture, I think, should be more well known, and to understand that change happened over those centuries, and we just recognize it, but then we say, it's an equally valid question to say, well, where did settled people come from? What are they made of? What are their populations? Some of them we know essentially, we can guess, you know, but we'd say they're Irish people, but they're also mixed with Scottish and English and many, many other people who came to this island over these centuries. And that's fair enough. But as Bernard pointed out, there's cultural issues that when you're pointing at one population, your research, and you're not recognizing another one, you know, the inequality, it can never be fixed, essentially. You know, you can't do it because you're not changing the system.
That was something Ina had mentioned, remember the lady from Norway, about if there's a group marginalised, well, who's doing the marginalising? If there's a group other, who's doing the othering? So it's kind of reversing and turning it around and asking, when we say settled people, we are also very aware that we are related to settled people. Settled is a cultural identity that I mentioned earlier that came from around the 12th century, and Dylan had mentioned that if you go back in time, the settled identity rather than the people, because you could have very Irish names but a very different cultural outlook. And that was once the minority from Dublin base, then Galway, then other towns, and that became the dominant culture. And Ireland's travellers were on the fringes, were marginalised and excluded. But of course, over a long period of time, this dominant group becomes reality. It's their fixed mentality. So therefore, they are the normal Irish, and there's something wrong with the travellers. They're a different kind of Irish. But as the ironies of archaeology and history and microbiome is when you turn it around and you go back far enough, we were not called travellers. We were not called thinkers. We were not called itinerants, because them labels came with the English. So who were the people then they were putting these labels on? And history would tell us, as Michael McDonough would say, and all the other travellers would say, travellers go by their surname. They're very proud of their surname. They're very fixated on their surname. They're not like settled people who go by occupational labels. I'm a doctor, I'm a scientist, I'm an archaeologist, and that's who they are. If you ask a traveller who they are, they'd say Sweeney, Ward, McDonough, Collins, and so on. I'll bring over to Colette. How would you approach it from an organisational point of view? Would it be mental health you would attach this to narratives and microbiome? Or is there another approach you'd like to take?
Firstly, I'd like to say that I come from a plantation town in County Donegal where travellers were not known as travellers. They might have been known as itinerants, they might have been talked about as tinkers, but generally the description was gypsy. And that came from the English colonial language and the Scottish, plantation. Just put it into the context of what I grew up with. To answer that question is interesting because I don't know, Sally Ann, were you there the day? But there was a number of us, it was Mary Cassidy, who's our community development worker. We met up with the people who did the SN solutions for that piece of research are also doing work for Sláinte Care Healthy Communities in Tala, and they were asking the questions. In that there's only working with 5 most marginalised areas, and that doesn't include where all the travellers are living in Tala. But they came to us anyway and they asked us that question, what needs to be changed? And we looked at one another and I kind of thought, oh God, And then I realised actually it has to go back to the state first of all, and that's the state apology. And nobody has mentioned it here, but there is a need for an apology for what has been done to travellers in the killing of the identity. And to prevent that, where does it go back to? When you go back to the child, what investment needs to go in to own, to be proud of that identity? And again, you mentioned, and I think you were the one person who mentioned it here earlier, Fergus, and that's the denial of identity. And then Mary mentioned it now. But that has, I mean, we know the community health workers, they call from door to door, they go to the halting sites, they go to the different group housing schemes. But the majority of travellers in Tala are living in houses. And when you have a traveller living in houses, they're born from their birth to their death, they still face racism. And, you know, first of all, oh, you're a traveller, you can't have, you have to have rice milk first. So people aren't identified because necessarily don't want to identify to be shown up as different. And then when they go to die, they have to pay in Tala, you have to pay up front to funeral homes. And particularly if it's a sudden death, you don't have, you know, under death by suicide. So you're facing racism on a day-to-day basis, and I've lost track of the question. But
I was actually approaching the state, and I think you're right. I would say is that when it comes, we've talked about this endlessly, about say the Dáil was shouted down about a firm apology at the night of the ethnicity.
yeah.
But on reflection,
But before the state apology, it, you know, and recognition of ethnicity is fine by Enda Kenny. That's a recognition. It is not written anywhere that there's an ethnic minority, Irish ethnic minority. It is not constitutionalised or legislated for or whatever. So there needs to be a step before the apology, and where those are actually, we have an ethnic minority that we need to protect. And protection means investment into being proud of everything from culture to the microbiome to the you know, and you know, I go, I've accompanied so many people to this council offices, actually just over in that corner over there, and the attitude, even though they come across as really nice when you're meeting them in meetings, and no offence to any of you councillors that are in the room, that but the attitude whenever you accompany a traveller, and you know that we want to make sure in the next traveller accommodation plan, oh, we might do a group housing scheme, but there'll be no space for the animals, which was in the task force of 1995, which sounds like ages ago, but it was, to me, the Bible of what travellers needed, because it was by travellers, essentially, and it talked about on a halting site or a group housing scheme, there needed to be a space for where you did your economic activity. If you're burning tires, that's not appropriate, obviously, because it's not healthy. But and also when it comes to copper, it's not a healthy place. But the economy needed to be provided for. Instead of that, what they've done is they've taken away all of those trades. They haven't encouraged people to participate in what would be traditional, or move on from copper making to doing something that's appropriate, culturally appropriate. But there are no spaces for travellers to do their traditional works and creativity. I go on and on. I could go on and on because I have loads of ideas, but they have to be traveller ideas.
why would the state apologise for? They actually do not understand why they will want to apologise. They think, in their minds, they were helping a group of people, that these people are destitute, and they don't know it yet, but we assimilate them and give them an education, like they did all over the world, civilised the savages, that things would be better. And in the fact we're still calling ourselves an ethnic group. Don't confuse ethnic with ethnicity, don't confuse with indigenous rights or indigenous people. How would we be an ethnic minority if we're an indigenous people? Where Roma can be ethnic, African Americans can be ethnic, the Lakota tribe is indigenous, the Maori is indigenous. So why are people from an island for centuries now classified as ethnic? So I would say the missing point of it, and we've touched on this, is the settled people have never been researched. The settled people do not know the history of the island. They know nothing about colonisation. They know nothing about how their own identity actually came about in the first place. So we would have to say that travellers would need to build their own psychological philosophy and create their own art system. And let us project an image, because we see it now at this stage that nobody is to blame. I mean, go back as far as you want, there's nobody to blame. because everybody grew up as a child in an environment and adopted it as their reality. And they would have believed it. If I grew up as a settled person and I was looking at the media, Travers fighting, Travers rowdy, Travers stealing, and if I was listening to the radio and the politics, I could grow up hating Travers without actually ever meeting a traveller or fearing travellers. That narrative has never been given to travellers to explain their side of the story. Sorry, Mary, go ahead, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, just even about the apology, I wouldn't want them. Because they would never mean it. They don't even understand who they are. So how are they going to ever truly understand us as a people? So it'd be a false mock apology, I believe, from the government. I mean, do you know, so...
Well, they did that with the recognition. It was symbolical. In other words, there will be no new person, no constitutional changes, there's going to be no financial rights. So in other words, we recognise you, but we're going to do nothing about it.
I was actually just about to go to that. I think Eddie Kenny just threw it in before he left as one last, to you, to the government, you deal with this. I'll leave you as this to deal with. Good luck to you. I don't think he truly meant it. They never do.
No.
They're killing their own, never mind us as people.
Susie wants to ask.
Sorry,
there
Susie.
before.
Sorry.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Just first of all, I just want to say this is really, really fantastic day. I mean, I think that we need to be much more of this, analysts, like real analysts on what the issues are that's impacting on travellers' mental health and travellers' health overall and all parts was really, really good. Back to what you were saying there about to come in and say that recognition is just enough. It needs to be recognition of the Indigenous nomadic community, and that's what brought about rights for the Aboriginals from other communities across the world that were in maybe similar conditions. And then I do have a question, but first of all, then in relation to the suicide piece, I mean, we know now, the stark statistics, they came from the Ireland Traveller Health Study, which was 2010, but that data was actually 2008. So you're talking 16 years ago. And I would firmly believe that's political, that they didn't put in a strategy, because if they did, with any other community in Ireland or anywhere else, if they realised how stark at that point the statistics were around suicide, they would have put in a strategy to restudy or to look at this properly in depth within 2 years' time, 4 years' time, 6 years' time, but that was never done. And I would firmly believe that's political, because then they would have to actually acknowledge all the things that we're talking about today, that how all these acts have impact on society. They'd have to acknowledge that during 1963, the mental health and the physical health of travellers was in a better condition than it is now, and that they would have to acknowledge that that's down to systems in there.
You wouldn't have to recognise it because if you open up a whole can of
Absolutely.
In other words, all right, so it's not travellers or Indigenous from the island over 70, not marginalised the islanders,
Absolutely.
the diaspora, the native Irish speakers. Do we not treat them similarly? I think that's what the state's approach would be. And then why would they fear that? Well, they'd have to go back to the default of saying, actually, under the threat of David Lloyd George, we never changed any of the English colonial institutions. Therefore, we self-educated ourselves to see the world through an English lens. And that is why in the National Development Plan 2 or 3 years ago, they left out several counties in the west of Ireland. This is a government doing a national development plan that in their consciousness, Donegal, Sligo and Mayo didn't exist.
Well, I would think it sounds money as well. I mean, if they acknowledge, that all these things around the accommodation, around the education, a lack of opportunities, then they have to put in money to create opportunities. But I did actually have a question, because I think a big issue that's been across for many, we've seen it down there in Tipperary, there during the last elections, and it was used by Peter Casey, about horses in particular. And horses, lack of accommodations for horses, animals, and particularly horses being taken away from the traveller community. So is there a piece of research, because I actually only recently was involved with families down in Clonmel, and there's a court case where the council are actually trying to remove their horses. So they're in the courts at the moment. So is there actually a piece of research through the work that you've been doing that can be used if something like that because you were saying animals are quite significant, so is there something that could actually be used when those cases are...
It may not be only horses, but horses particularly are associated with stuff that needed to be taught. They wouldn't necessarily look like what we think is right. And I think successive Irish governments have looked at travellers and they've used the word traveller problem. Traveller problem. It's telling in itself, but some of them have been well intended. They aren't all Peter Casey's. Some of them have been well intentioned, trying to do the right thing, but misguided. And the misguidance is that the best thing they could do for travellers is make travellers look and sound and be like the settled community. So stick them into houses, give them education, and make them all look the same. And this word assimilation. That's why I began with John Hume saying that difference is the essence of humanity. We should be celebrating differences, not trying to. I don't think melting pots work. It doesn't work in North America. The idea of a melting pot make us all look the same. Actually, we should be, instead of making us all look the same, celebrating our differences. And I think John Hume was right on that. But I think you have to take control. You absolutely have to get, in the end, you have to take
I think
control.
it starts really with the narrative. In other words, the traveller needs to have a kind of uniformed idea of understanding where we came from, to understand where we go.
I'll say about that, if I can mention that the microbiome brings you back, because it's pre-industrial, it kind of brings you back in historical terms to a time before the state is in control of the whole country. Because Ireland didn't industrialise at that time. It wasn't that kind of culture. And history very useful in that regard, because we know at that time that Gaelic Ireland, actually every facility, every fort, every house and every ring fort had by law to have a green around it for horses, just as a matter of interest. But well, of course, that law system was replaced by an English one, which wasn't concerned about that, and that's really the point about it. The councils and everything else use that same law system, like we're talking about. And just to give a more slightly hopeful or a slightly different way of looking at it in how you would go forward with that, I want to mention that thing that I often mention, which is, I think, important. The Supreme Court decision about it from a case, you've mentioned court cases, the Supreme Court decision about that took the Constitution in Ireland and the definition of a house. It gives protection to the home. But over the years since the foundation of the Free State, how the courts interpret that, it turns out, it doesn't say what type of home in the Constitution, but it's always been interpreted as being, naturally, the only real home is an English type of home, we would call it. I would say in English, I know something to do with them, but it's to do with that type of bricks and mortar that was legally recognised. And because of the law system, that's all. But the courts were interpreting it as that, and then saying, well, the travellers don't live in proper houses. But that's a hangover from the imperial, the days of the empire, and going as far back as you want, in a sense, centuries. So one way forward is that the Supreme Court decision that was recently given in a case in Clare, I believe it was, simply interpreted the law by widening the definition to include travellers' homes in the definition of what's a home, and therefore all the protections automatically now extend to even people in a caravan or a mobile home or whatever type of home they're living in the halt sites. It automatically now has got the same protection as what was before only given to a settled house, if you want to call it that, or a house.
That's incredible.
Can I make one, sorry to interrupt, can I make just one follow-up on that? First thing I just want to say is, if there's any take-home message about the microbiome, what is, just to re-echo what you said, the microbiome shows that it's the settled community that changed.
Yeah.
Modernization has changed microbiomes. The travellers have retained their ancient microbiome until they were forced to change, particularly with lots of legislation, but particularly that act in 2002. That's when the most profound change happened. Now, in terms of culturally sensitive houses and the space that you were talking about, that's what I'd like to point out is all these houses I see in town, all these sheets of houses, like rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of them, they need parks as well. The settled community needs those spaces. The travellers have been talking about it for so long. Settled kids, they actually should be having the same thing.
Yeah.
This is it, because it's like a concrete jungle.
Yeah.
You know, it is.
Yeah, that's what they should be having.
There was one other thing remarkable about, following on what Dylan was saying about that particular court case, which was on the 31st of January in 2022, and the Supreme Court ruler was Gerard Hogan. And we found out later he loves history. Isn't that amazing? And he was informed by history. And this word is quite commonly used. I only heard it from a wonderful guy called Robbie McPhee a year and a half ago, paradigm. It's very common in the academia world, I believe. Changing the paradigm, shifting the paradigm. And then I looked up the word paradigm. It's an old Greek word, and it means to show side by side. But it also means pattern of thoughts. And I said, that is perfect. Because we're talking about psychology and mentalities. So what Gerard Hogan did to the state was he put up what was already in the constitution as a home, but the state recognised it, as Dylan said, bricks and mortar. He said, no, that's just the way you see it. That's one way of looking at it. That's the way the English look at it. But if you're from Ireland and informed with Gaelic history, you'd see the home is quite different. It could be wicker, it could be movable, it could be anything but a home. May I, were you going to say something earlier on that I cut you off?
No, I just remembered I wanted to, well,
Or was I
Oh,
just
that
thinking you wanted to
story.
say something?
I had a story, but I think that we should put it out.
Yeah,
to
that's what
everybody
we'll do. I'd like to open it up and if there's any questions whatsoever, and we'll hand up at the very top.
Thanks. So I'm one of those dreaded politicians. So I'm John Lart is my name. I'm TD for this area, and I'm 25 years in public life. Just a couple of comments, if I can make them. I found the conversation, presentation of biomes really fascinating. If I could use maybe a metaphor, the way it struck me was, you know, about 5 or 10 years ago, wild flower meadows along the sides of roads were kind of frowned upon, and we very much favoured the, you know, cutting areas within an inch of their life and having everything kind of symmetrical. And it's funny how over a short period of time we accept the wilding of areas, and seeing poppies and dandelions has suddenly become attractive to the eye. And it was very unattractive to the eye a short period of time ago, because now we know the importance of, now we know why we're doing it. And that's what struck me about what you were saying about biomes, that it's not that I was looking at the traveller community in a particular way, but that's quite a little gem to kind of bring to the perspective of, for want of a better term, a settled person. I do know where I come from, by the way, and I've kind of traced it through the genetic thing that you can do nowadays, and it's very much West Kerry and Tipperary, and it doesn't seem to have any international stamp on it at all, going back. But as a politician over 25 years, I mean, I could give you a chapter and verse of what it's like to represent a constituency made up of those who come from many different traditions and backgrounds. But one of the things that I think I would encourage is this. In fact, I wouldn't just encourage it, I'd insist on it. I would have, I'd say, maybe 20 traveller communities in the constituency. And aside from, at a very superficial level, in South Dublin, and a member of South Dublin County Council for 17 years, there's no conversation between settled people and travellers. There's just simply no conversation ever takes place. There's no engagement ever takes place. And there's always a middle institution that mediates that, whether it's the local authority or the travel accommodation group, etc., etc. I mean, I would insist in a county development plan, and there are some really good organisations like South Dublin Mediation Services in the context of South Dublin County, that everywhere there's a traveller, where there's traveller accommodation, that there has to be engagement and conversations with the local community. And structures set up to facilitate that. Because what really struck me, and it's easy for me to say this as someone who's sitting in the back row watching on, and I found this really valuable, and I'm really glad I came. And you can take that whatever way you want to take it.
Don't think we don't like it.
Oh no, that doesn't.
We do like it.
But I suppose
things that happen to us,
No,
has affected us, that has now led the taste in our mouth.
I get that.
Question what is you as a councillor is going to be
Yeah.
or a TD. So, but I mean, like the local councillors are here.
Yeah, I would say, well, I know that, so on the plus side, I know that travellers come to me, okay? On the minus side, I'd say I don't do an awful lot. I'd say I have probably a greater awareness than some of my colleagues, but of the lives of travellers and the challenges, not just mental health, but in terms of special needs of their children. Also know have a reasonable insight into some of the challenges family space. But I suppose I don't want to get into that. I need an awful lot of education, but I'm just one person, And so as a public representative, I suppose what I'm saying over a long period of time is my challenge as a TD or as a councillor is I need to bring my my constituency with me, okay? And I think to do that, while everything about the presentation was excellent, I suppose one of the things that struck me is this is a conversation you're having with yourselves here. And that's not a criticism, it's just an observation, okay? It's taking a helicopter view. I've come in, I've hovered, and I've watched, and you may say, but that's completely inaccurate. That's not what this is about. But as I said, about 20 traveller communities in Dublin Southwest at least. There's never engagement. Big part was because the settler community doesn't want to engage. And maybe the traveller community doesn't want to engage. But that has to happen. It has to happen to create that conversation. I wasn't here for the John Hume piece, but that conversation, that's what he insisted on, was this conversation between two different traditions, because you'll get no understanding. And what you get is a community, I just see it more and more entrenched. And of course, there's acting out, and there's a particular kind of view of travellers among the settled community who don't see 10 times as bad behaviour emanating from their own community. But I think that conversation would be a first place, and that to insist on it, that we have community councils, we have all of those kind of things, and that one part of that should be a regular conversation. There should be insistence on it. And that's just, and I don't say it lightly. I say it after seeing just no progress after 25 years.
Thank you very much. I would say briefly on all that is that we don't hold an animosity or a blame.
My charge of it.
Yeah, but settled people, if you look at even Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in the last 5 years, they're a different party than they were 10 years ago, much different party than they were 50 years ago. So we see a sense of equality in the physical, materialistical way of equality, better services, better environment, better health, better technology, better science. But at the same time, this wasn't being applied to travellers. In other words, it was getting worse. So we always bring it back to that point where we're not blaming settled people. We didn't put the label settled people on settled people. It was the English many centuries ago who created a class system from the wild Irish, civil Irish, to the gentleman, woman and Irish. So that's an old system. And it comes from England, that's perfectly fine. If any of the systems you track in Ireland, education or law, goes back to Westminster. So we would say it's not travellers and settled issue, because most of the settled people came from a travelled background, but over decades and centuries had been assimilated into a settled Irish identity. So we would say, yeah, dialogue and conversation is vitally important. And we're not going into this of a blame game. We see other issues happening around the world, the rise of fascism, the re-emergence of fascism and racism, and so on and so forth. We see the potential of a united Ireland with the Protestants. We would say, as a Tradition Foundation and Traveller Perspective, that we could be the catalyst for creating that, because we're outside of all of your institutions. So, two women there, you first, yeah, and then my friend.
So my name is Jess Begley. I'm a newly elected councillor on South Dublin County Council. That's how I found out about this event. An email was sent to Paul Murphy's office and got forwarded to myself, and I'm so happy that I came along. You can probably tell from my accent that I come from America. I've lived here for 8 years, and I still find it really hard to understand traveller racism, because as your presentation pointed out, same skin colour, same background, but divergence in history, right? And it reminds me a lot, although it's very different, obviously, of the situation in the United States with the Indigenous population and the reservations and the suicide rates and the deprivation that exists there. And I think, firstly, my real question was just where can I learn more of the history? Because when you discussed the history and the divergence and how travellers have maintained a culture, how did you do that? That's amazing to have done that in the face of such brutal colonization, that so much of the population was forced to assimilate, but a section of the population somehow was able not to assimilate and was able to hold out for so long, all the way up to the 90s, and feel confident about an identity. How did that happen? And if you have resources, I would be so happy and grateful to learn more about that because I think that's a really important part that so many people, Irish people don't know about, right? All the people I know don't know about that and don't know that history. And just to say, like, and the comments from yourself, Colette, are really helpful, and I'll be looking to the Tala Travellers organisation for guidance on what we can do as councillors to try to make the situation better. But I would just say, in terms of dialogue, to the comment that was made before me, I think a lot of the steps have to come from those that are in power and those who have access to the resources. And I find it a bit, I guess, wrong to say that those that are holding such an event, that are trying to educate people, that somehow the educational event was somehow organised in an incorrect manner, and that the dialogue and that the steps have to come from those that have less than those that are in power. I don't know, I find that a bit wrong.
It's only right to hand it over to the qualified discipline of history and archaeology about how that might have happened. Again, it'd be guesswork because we're still working it out, we're still researching.
Yeah.
I would say that we are not completely different from any ethnic group or indigenous group in America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, or the other 57 countries, because what happened here in Ireland happened here for centuries before it was exported to America. And they deliberately set out to change the Irish psyche. I mean, that was a deliberate attempt to change how these people were going to think. And by law, they would go to an English school. Of course, that happened in other parts of the African continent, Australia, Canada. After the label, for a better use of the word, as our friend has said, TD, and thank you for coming, I appreciate it, is that, as we mentioned, we didn't put that term on settled people. Settled what came from the English settler colonisation. But they've been so long in Dublin, they became settled Irish. So in the 13th century, the English in England were mocking the English in Ireland because they were taking up an Irish accent. So they would call them Irish dogs. And then the English in Dublin would call them hobbies. Then Henry II came in and said, stop that or I'll put you to jail because you're all my subjects. So get on with each other. And that's why you have, like, beyond the pale, that kind of mentality still exists. But Dylan, have you found any history that would explain?
Can I say something? Sorry,
Yeah,
Kay wants to say something there.
Yeah,
But can I just respond to Indigenous peoples around the world and the parallels with travellers? I've had the privilege of living and working in Brazil and meeting with Indigenous peoples from all around Brazil, and at one point we actually had two people from the Guarani Kaiwa come and meet with travellers and look at the parallels. But where was I go with this? Oh yeah, recently I attended a film about the Putumayo and Roger Casement, which is very interesting because, and I stood up at the end of it and I talked about resilience and why, because Roger Casement said, we need to stand up and fight, and how difficult it is to be a minority to do that. Because if you actually think about less than 1%, as you put up in your presentation, of travellers, Brazilian Indigenous peoples are less than 1%. And I talked about this and the impact of how difficult it is to stand up and fight, but that it's the importance of holding on to and being resilient for your culture. And the ambassador, a Brazilian ambassador, said, the Indigenous people own 12% of the land in Brazil, and they're only 1% or less than 1%. And I went, but still part of the corralling. And I talked about corralling travellers into halting sites. That's and that's like the reservations and the impact of being corralled into one place and not being able to. The suicide rates are paralleled across the world. The addiction issues paralleled, and until there is universities led by the Indigenous peoples, which there are in parts of Brazil. There's one in the northeast of Brazil that's an Indigenous university. So we need to learn from that and be led by travellers. And sorry.
Yeah, no, we're okay. Just on the history and the origins of the story, it has been written. This sounds like common sense when we put it into common sense. But if you were to look anywhere in the institutions, it's not common sense. They still have this, even the NGOs have the narrative wrong. They're called us ethnic and we know written history and we lived on the fringes and we know connection to Gaelic Ireland. None of that's true with them. And also myself and Dylan are trying to put together a book on a lot of what we've learned and what we've learned. Did you put your hand up?
I did.
Go ahead.
See, I get his attention.
Okay.
Somebody else wants
Oh
to say
shit,
something.
stop that. Go ahead.
It's grand. No, listen, I've lived in Tala now, best part, except for 6 years, okay? Going back, I'm not sure whether Deputy Lahart would remember this, when the Tala bypass was being constructed. And there was a thing going on with Dublin City Council at the time to provide halting sites, you know, for the traveller community. They were promised a halting site, never happened. So they parked on the where they were constructing the bypass. And I had never seen such hatred shown to people by people then. Now, bear in mind, I was a teenager, okay? And my mum and a few other people from St. Rose got really, really fed up with the shenanigans that was going on. So they went over, we had the protest to support the people that were there, through no fault of their own, on a bypass, and being basically called the most vile names that I had heard at that time. To me, we have always had racism in this country, but it has been hidden. And it was hidden because no state agency, no media, nobody would actually write about the racism towards the travelling community. And that is shameful to say. That's absolutely shameful. And I'm sorry, it just really, really gets me angry. We have had successive governments allowing this narrative to happen. Now, I may as well, I'm a newly elected councillor to South Dublin County Council as well. And I will be questioning the funding. Where does the funding actually go that the council has? Who benefits from this funding? Why is this funding never spent?
Yeah.
Who answers them? That's questions that I will be putting into the council.
I just go towards one more and I don't get paid.
You know that way.
Exactly.
Why are they getting paid?
Exactly. And that funding should be spent and it should be used where it's supposed to go. You know that way. I mean, I volunteered in the school. Sorry, I'll finish on this. I volunteered in the school in Jobestown, St. Thomas's. I used to help kids, you know, English, maths. And we were called, there was 2 of us volunteered, and we were called into the principal's office one day and told there was children from a travelling site, from a halting site, coming up to the school, and would one of us mind taking them separately into a separate room? And I'm standing here going, no. Why? Why have I to take children from the travelling community into a separate room for English and maths when there's a perfectly big room out there, integrate the lot? So the 2 of us, fair play, said, no, we're not going to do this, find someone else, blah, blah, blah.
What was their answer?
Well, 2 or 3 days later, when they realised there was no one willing to step up, it was changed. You know, it was changed. So the children were integrated, as rightly they should be. But it just, sorry, I know I'm going on, it just so angers me. This is not something that has just come out of the blue. You know that way. And I mean, when are people going to take responsibility for what is going on? That's my question. And it has to fall back on those who are in power, those who hold the purse strings, and those who decide to stand up every now and then, make a feel-good speech, and then go away. That's not good enough. So,
Even was it 10 years ago? Was Park Mines 10 years? 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Like after that happened, the families, I mean, that was the biggest tragedy in Ireland at the time. And those families were originally going to be moved into an area that they'd lived in previously. The people in that state,
object.
not just objected, they put
But
their
they-
cards, and it was very similar to the pictures you would have seen back during the bypass with these horrible placards.
Yeah.
And they were allowed. You know, I mean, the car should have been physically removed. But
I actually said that a couple of weeks ago. We're seeing nothing to do with refugees now, with the police going out and protect them where they're being put. But I said that about Carrick Mines for my auntie needed some place to bring her family. They come out and the police done absolutely nothing.
it was allowed to happen. So
Yeah, it's allowed to happen.
Yeah.
Just because it's traffic.
They grew up in an environment that allowed for that in the first place. They actually encouraged it from the 60s. They put it on the media, they put it on the radio, they sent it out into villages. Of course, no travellers knew about this, so people grew up hearing this biasm, and it developed over time. And it's just a sad thing to reverse that, of course, is allowing travellers to tell their story. I have said this a couple of times, this sounds even incredible to be explaining this stuff. This narrative has never been told before, although it's a very old narrative. As many people have said to me, how would you know? Do you think you know more than the person in Trinity College? Do you think you know more than the person in the EU? And I say, if it is about me, my family, my identity, absolutely I do. So even blaming the state isn't fair or just. The only way out of it is retelling the stories and reshaping a narrative. Because we don't want this divide. We don't want to blame certain people and make them feel bad, or them to pity us and them to feel kind of guilt-ridden, because that wouldn't do their children any good, or their grandchildren, seeing their parents grovelling like that. So there has to be a balance, I think.
I might mention that one of the great techniques of people, colonies or empires, is that one of the first things they do to the place they invade is they cut people from their history. And the reason they do that is it immediately breaks the connection to the past, and this means they have no power. And that kind of thing can continue into the present, that even without blaming people as individuals, the machine that was set up, or the system that had been inherited here, continued to do that. And literally that's why we think in that, one of the answers is just to reconnect that to the past. And I would say that what the other person had said, it is a remarkable survival, a remarkable story. It's a central story just to Irish history, and that it's important as well to realise that we haven't changed anything in Irish history. It's actually quite standard history. But when you look at it a certain way, and when we're talking in this environment, the history doesn't change, but our perception of it in the present does. Yeah. And we suddenly see, well, wait a second, like moving a kaleidoscope, and everything suddenly goes, wait a second, this is actually just normal history. And actually there would have been a time that all of the discrimination and the things that you describe would say, like, not that long ago, let's say in the 1850, when the famine happened in this country, huge parts of the country would have been essentially an enormous reservation. They were that. Huge parts of the country that wouldn't have differentiated people as being, they wouldn't have noticed travellers. Even the Gaelic society was, in fairness, diverse, okay, different types of people in it. And some people moving and some people not so much. But the administration didn't differentiate them. There was just this huge millions of Gaelic speaking and people across the whole of the centre and west and south of the country, and even as close as Wicklow here in the mountains, who were treated exactly the same way. If you read the things at the time, you'll see that they're from the authorities and the councils, because it's not ancient history. You'll find that they're saying exactly the same things that you're describing now, you know, like the discrimination, the not engaging with them, and this marginalisation from the state.
But isn't this something that has happened, say, to settled people themselves over generations, such as even the penal laws, were to almost berate people and belittle people, turn them against, alienate them from their own culture and identity?
Yeah, so what I mean by that, though, is without going into all of that history, what I mean is that once you reconnect it, that opens all that up. And suddenly you realise that even traveller history is actually, it's not that it's not there, it's that it's actually the centre, it's central to Irish history and others. To correct it. Once you understand it in that way around, then it's very important in the whole story.
We're going to go to Fergus and then Sarah, I believe, is it? Yeah.
And then it's 5 o'clock.
And then we'll also wrap up then. And we got a final word from everyone. Do you want to say something, sir?
So I've taken so many notes during this. You guys have given me weeks of material to go research. But first, if I could talk to you just really quickly afterwards about a very specific thing, that would be great. And sorry, these are a few small points. Dylan and Bernard, the book that you're working on, I'd love to know if I could support that. I see some parallels with some work I've done with energy system planning, but I think maybe I could help, but I can explain that another time. But I've got three kind of short, or one short question, one medium, and one longer. It doesn't have to be answered now, but the short one is, where did the conflation of travellers and Roma come from? That's something I've heard a lot, and you guys mentioned.
It's the EU, just bundled everybody together. The voyage in France, there are essentially French travellers, and so it came in under the European Roma rights.
Also, I think it was in 2011, a particular national organisation went into Europe and gave a presentation and told them that we came from Central Europe and that we were related to gypsies.
Yeah.
It's just, it's something I've,
Yeah.
I've
We need to do a song and dance to distinguish the two
Yeah.
in our paper, and there's good genetic evidence to show it's not true, cultural evidence, migration evidence, tons of evidence to show it's not true, but it was just conflated in as, it's ignorance in the end of the day.
But it's also with the interest in national traveller inclusion, national traveller and Roma inclusion strategy, all the organisations are having to, you know, for funding and all this, because
Yeah.
they from Europe, like they're saying, it's sort of.
All the organisations you speak of are run by settled people. I'm not giving out about them, as you say, they're lovely people, they're kind people, they're sincere people.
Traveller Council Services.
Yeah.
And
The
the
director
Irish
is-
travel
But,
agreement.
I'll have to, not correct you.
Okay, so what he means is
Eh,
ran by old ways of thinking and to the ways that we should be looking at going forward. Because there's so much that has happened, so much history with organisations between us here. Even myself, like, you know, looking back at working within some of the organisations.
If you think about it, I mean, the organisations themselves are designed for the convenience of settled people. They've nothing to do with travellers. And not criticise them. And even if anyone, if I went to a French school, I'd pick up a French culture and a language. If I went to a German, I might do the same thing. So if a traveller goes into a settled institution, they too will adopt a narrative that's leaning towards the institution. We see this in actual fact with so I don't know,
Like this
so-
for a conversation.
Yeah. We need to have a convention.
Yes, we will. We'll cut you off here right now. So
It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
It does not have to be that way. You don't have to forfeit your culture and your identity and yet engage with another group. That does not have to happen.
I'll just bring
So-
everything that I have in me with me.
Absolutely. So, for example, the Scots, if they eventually do get out from under the yoke of the UK and join the EU, they can retain their identity, as we have in the EU. I mean, we can all retain our identity, but I just want to, can I just address something that, first of all, congratulations to the councillors who got elected, and thanks to Deputy Lart who raised an interesting comment. You mentioned about hatred, this profound hatred, which I agree, and I think it's got worse in the last, since I've been back in Ireland in the last 25 years. It's worse now than certainly before I went away. I think the deputy at the back is absolutely correct, and thank you for coming. Not the whole solution, but part of the solution has to be engagement. And I wouldn't want this meeting to end I wouldn't want to walk out the door and feeling, oh, it's hopeless, and be depressed about the whole thing. I do think you have to, people have to persist, but engagement does help. We've had examples of hatred in this island before. We've had examples where the Irish went to America and they were profoundly hated. Absolutely hated, despised, regarded as dirt. All the words we've been hearing were used about the Irish over there. What made the difference? A number of things, but one of them was engagement. The more the existing Americans there got to know the Irish, the more they realised, well, they're human, they've got children, they've got lives to lead, their culture's interesting, but the Irish did not have to forfeit their identity and their culture to be accepted. We saw it in Northern Ireland as well. We see it everywhere. You don't have to, if you go into an institution, yes, there's pressure to change, and there's give and take, of course, but you don't have to sacrifice your identity in any of those situations. But I would say part of the solution, just again to echo what the Deputy back said, some of this has to be engagement, because what's happened in the last 25 years, I remember my parents, for example, they both came from the country. I grew up in Dublin, in an urban situation. There's been progressive urbanisation. Most travellers, as we heard, are now in the Tallaght region, they're in Limerick, they're in Cork, they're urbanised. Once was a time when my parents grew up on farms, when they had a very benign view of travellers. I never heard a kind of a foreignness or an otherness or a racism or a bigotry or any of that from them, because they were familiar with travellers. Travellers used to come along and do seasonal work with the farmers. Now, more farmers were doing tillage and more of them were on the land, but travellers would come by, they'd be nomadic, but the farmers knew they'd come by and they'd do seasonal work and then they'd move on, so they needed them. And there was a lot more interaction. All of that seems to have gone now. And travellers, even though they're living in cities, they might as well be living in a different country, it seems to me, for the lack of real engagement. And until you engage, you can't break down the hatred.
Just one thing, Hannah McGinley has written a piece for the curriculum in history or within schools, a traveller, and it's going to be implemented in through
Nice
the
progress.
Department of Education. We
Yeah.
do have to acknowledge that you did that piece of work, and I think Owen Bardoon was involved in it too.
Yeah, I was at the presentation with me along.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it is very delicate, it's identity at the end of the day. And where I do get emotionally about it sometimes, I get triggered by it sometimes because I've been a long time kind of campaigning about this, campaigning and complaining. And yeah, of course, it gets me every so often, and sometimes I kind of lash out of organisations or lash out of politicians or lash out of people. But these are just human, natural responses to a situation that is still greatly misunderstood, even by our representatives. Hey, open it up. Did we close it for final
Sorry,
words?
yes, we're going to close it. So one thing from each of you, Colette, I'll let you go last because obviously yourself, I'll let you and then Bernard. So yourself, Dylan, what would like to add to it? One thing that you would like to see going forward for...
Well, I'm going to reiterate that thing, which I think was hopeful. I mightn't have explained it very well, but that court decision where it widened the definition of the home, I think the next stage would it leads to other widening the definition of the. If the system was set up originally to destroy Irish culture or to break people from the history, then it's quite simple to turn it once you're aware of that. Yeah, and then you just say, well, actually, there's other ways of living on this island, and we're going to have to make them legal as well. If you know what I mean, and it starts to change. It's changing the society as a whole rather than keeping people trapped on one side of the fence or the other. If you know what I mean, and I think that's quite. I think that's maybe not the whole answer, but it's part of it. And I think that was a very progressive way of doing it, because actually the state starts to acknowledge that there was older there's other cultures on the island. There's actually older cultures than just this body of law that we took that came from the colonial time. And we don't have to just implement it blindly all the time. We can take into account, which that decision did. He expressly said in that decision that actually the law we inherited in 1922 came from certain circumstances, and maybe our state had not altered the laws in ways that would have made things better for people on the island. And he kind of basically said it that way. Now it's a small step, but I think that it can be then applied to these cases you're talking about with horses.
I think it was actually a major step, but so many
Three
judges
voices.
before that
Yeah.
just denied the...
It's a Supreme Court, so I think it actually is hopeful. It sets a precedent and actually does put into law what Enda Kenny had, when he said ethnic status, he said there is no law, but actually that decision makes it law now.
Yeah.
So there is some law now, which is that recognition of the home. Now, if they recognise a home as being because of a different ethnic status, then it can extend to animals and extend to other things that are traditional, like movement.
After that, there was actually a High Court ruling where they recognised that horse was also part of the culture. Not because how do you interpret what a home is, because the family wanted the horse part of the culture, and they recognised the horse part of the culture and overruled the local authority.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of a beginning of it, yeah.
That's all I'll say, we're wrapping up.
Yeah.
So Fergus, yourself, what would...
I just say, well, you've all said, I agree with everything that's been said. I'd just say, despite the research fatigue, which is totally understandable, and while research moves slowly, there is good research as well. And if you think research is fatiguing, try ignorance. So don't give up on the research. It's absolutely needed to address all the issues you've been talking about.
Yeah. But I just even go back to it, I'm sick of research, and the reason why I'm saying it is that do we really need more research? Because
well, not for that.
No, but you know what I mean. We
totally
need to
agree
know
with
that
you there.
the necessity of research for us as people going.
Maybe
going
it's
forward.
kind of what kind of research do we need?
Asking the right questions.
So with yourself, Colette.
Okay, I have about 10 things I want to say. First of all, in relation to the identity and the loss of identity and education, I've spoken to loads of travellers who say, oh, I don't want my children to get an education because it means that they'll lose their identity and who they are. And something needs to be in place to ensure the protection and support to own that identity during education. And that's one thing. Then I want to invite people who are here in solidarity to ask to be on the LTACC, which is the Local Traveller Accommodation. You have to request or show interest to be on it. So, and then to come and talk to St. Travellers, you want the history, talk to Patrick. He'll give you chapter and verse. And again, before I forget, Patrick's been ringing and texting, and sorry he couldn't be here, but he really would want to contribute to it. The other thing is, from what Professor Shanahan was saying earlier, Fergus, about the whole investment in health. We talk on a daily basis, don't we, Sally Ann, about the need for a medical card for all travellers, and this is a practical thing. So I'll give this to you, Deputy Hart, that every traveller in the country, no matter whether they have a very high paid job, income huge, or whether they're on social welfare or whatever and trying to get a job, you need a medical card to have access to get to see a doctor. And I know I'm going on about this, but that is needed because the travellers die 12 and 15 years, if not even 18 years, I think, for men now, younger than the settled population. So we have to remember that. And about research fatigue, researching the organisations that are delivering, like the local authorities and their, public sector duty or whatever, it needs to be, how are they treating people? Not how travellers are, not asking travellers on a daily basis, oh, how's your water or sanitation or whatever, how are you doing? Ask, what are the institutions doing to make sure travellers are included? So that's it. That's it. And thank you all for coming.
What I'd like to add is just for the younger generation going forward to be able to be proud of who they are and not to carry that shame. And as Hannah McGinley said a couple of weeks back in UCD, the hand shame back. It was never our shame to hold or to have. It was given to us or it was ingrained on top of us. And I want my daughter to be able to grow up in a world that's proud of who she is as a young traveller woman, and not have to, I've dealt with her trying to take her own life through suicide 5 times through her school years, and now she's going to the army, and there's so much ahead of her for life, but not to have to carry somebody else's shame or somebody else's ignorance with her just because they expect her to, for her to be proud, young woman. A young traveller. Say yourself, Bernard.
Yeah, just to say on education, the purpose of educational institutions in the first place was to teach you things. Something that you wanted to learn, something that you liked to learn. And unfortunately, there isn't an educational institution in Ireland that we could learn about ourselves. So when travellers have fear of losing their identity in the education, they're absolutely categorically right, because there is no topic or subject in there that addresses our identity, our origins, or indeed the settlement. I would say decolonisation was a long word. It's about decolonisation is decolonialising our own patterns of thoughts, how we think about ourselves and the people around us. I would also say through Vision Foundation, because we don't have a formal education, it's about movies, arts, films, cartoons, and so on and so forth. Because we believe that our narrative hasn't been told in all that long time, as mentioned earlier on. So unless we have that, this situation, even with the best intentions of people, will keep worsening, because the stats and the facts that they're producing are telling us exactly that. I think I would say finally is that, absolutely, global peace. I believe Ireland was the first overseas country to be colonised, so it has an origin story. It has something that has not been contributed to broader global discussions on colonisation. I believe healing begins here in Ireland.
I want to say thank you very much, Bernard.
Thank you very much for coming out. I think of our guests, Dylan, my good friend, Mary, my good friend, Colette, newfound friend, and Daddy Bear here. But this guy goes out of his way and he takes a passion in what he does, and that's reflective in how the travellers engage with him. So that's a big step about dialogue and engagement, isn't it? Thank you very much, folks. Thank you.
Thank you.